to happen. How about that? We're, as I said, movements are embedded in particular moments. So Women's Action Forum for 10 years fought against to prevent any further rescinding of our rights. The next 10 years we probably spent trying to get those laws and policies into place, which Ayesha is talking about. The challenge, I think, today, which we have not yet managed, is the next generation needs to tackle the societal change that was engineered under Zia, of which we're seeing the impact today. It is your challenge of this generation to find the cultural dimensions of expressive ways of being part of that movement. We did not have the time to do that. I would urge you to do that. The second thing is to find the women's movement is good at saying what we don't want. We don't have a vision of where we want to go. And I think that is something that needs to be made explicit, because you need a dream that you can reach for through your creative expressions, because the people who are stopping you are often not the state now. It's your neighbors, it's your relatives. You need to change the discourse that's happening in society, and I think doing so one just has to bear in mind that the movement, any women's movement, always has a very interesting, multiple faceted relationship with the state. Because much of what we demand is from the state, and yet the state, in many instances, is also an oppressor and a denier of women's rights. And so that negotiation has to take place. But I think the challenge for us today is to do this, and also the second challenge, I think, is to find the spaces to put back the politics in the women's movement, to find spaces to discuss with each other and see where it is, what we want to do. Maybe we can't all work together, but maybe we can. To make a reality the diversity that exists in terms of age, in terms of ethnicity and class, and ethnic and other backgrounds, we need to bring those together. So even if we work in our own places, we can all move together.
Thank you. I think with that, we'll open the house to questions. I'm sure there are lots of questions. And, okay, 3 or 4. So we have about 15 minutes only. Okay, will somebody pass the mic, please? Yes, so there's a gentleman in the front and there are many at the back. If you have it specifically for one of the panelists, please tell us. It should be a question,
yes,
not a long...
It is a question. सवाल ये है कि जिस तरह हमारे जो फंडामेंटलिस्ट या लिटलिस्ट तबका है हमारी सोसाइटी में, जो कुछ ईरान से आता है, सऊदीया से आता है, उसको एज इट इज़ एक्सेप्ट कर लिया जाता है. क्या हमारे यहाँ के फेमिनिस्ट वेस्ट से आने वाले कॉन्सेप्ट को एज सच एक्सेप्ट नहीं कर लेते, और उसका हमारे कल्चर के साथ मुताबिकत ना रखने की वजह से हमारी सोसाइटी से उस पर रिटेलिएशन आती है और इससे फेमिनिस्ट कॉज को नुकसान पहुंचता है? क्या ये बात सही है या नहीं? और दूसरी बात ये, क्या इंडिजिनसली चीज़ों को, और जिस तरह अभी बताया इन्होंने कि एक गोल, एक ऑब्जेक्टिव क्लियर नहीं है, तो वो गोल देने से और एक इंडिजिनसली मूवमेंट को लेके चलने से और वो जो वेस्ट से आइडियाज़ आते हैं यहाँ पे उनको एक्सेप्ट किया जाता है, तो वो इन टर्न एक रिटेलिएशन जनरेट करता है सोसाइटी में से और मौका देता है उन एक्सट्रीमिस्ट तबकों को इस मूवमेंट को क्रिटिसाइज करने का. तो वो कॉज को नुकसान नहीं पहुंचाता क्या?
ठीक हो गया.
देखिए, ये बहुत मुद्दत से हमें ये कहा गया है कि ये मगरिब ज़दा ख़वातीन जो हैं बाहर का एजेंडा ले आती हैं, ये पता नहीं क्या क्या कर रहे हैं. अपॉलॉजीज़ टू द नॉन उर्दू स्पीकर्स. लेकिन बात ये है कि आप अगर अभी पहले जो सेशन में कर रही थी, आसमा जहांगीर जैसे कोई एक्टिविस्ट हैं, ये कभी बाहर गई नहीं थी, उन्होंने पढ़ाई यहाँ की, अपने एक्टिविज़म यहाँ से शुरू किया है, उन्होंने जाके और लोगों को सिखाया है. दूसरा ये है कि इसी चीज़ के ऊपर मैंने तो एक मॉड्यूल बनाया जिसका नाम है ग्रेट एंसेस्टर्स. जो औरतों ने इस्लाम के दूसरे सदी से लेकर 1950 से अब आपके अफ्रीका से लेके इंडोनेशिया तक औरतें जो कि अपने हक के लिए खड़ी होकर उन्होंने मांगे हैं. ये कोई एक जगह का नहीं है. जो ये सोच है ना कि ये गलत है, जो नाइंसाफ़ी की पहचान है, वो बिल्कुल मगरबी नहीं है. ہر جگہ ناانصافی کی پہچان ہوتی ہے اور ہر جگہ عورتوں نے اپنے حقوق حاصل کرنے کے لیے اور سماجی انصاف کے لیے وہ کھڑی ہوئی ہیں اور انہوں نے جد و جہد کی ہے. تو یہ تو ہمیں اپنی ہسٹری سیکھنی چاہیے, ہمیں خود جا کے وہ انڈیجنس ہسٹری جب تک ہمیں نہیں پتہ ہوگا کہ یہاں پر ہے, اور اس لیے جو عائشہ نے لکھا ہے کہ وہ آپ کے ہسٹری کا ڈاکیومنٹیشن ہے, بہت ضروری ہے. بہت ضروری ہے کہ ہم اپنی ہسٹری کو ریٹریو کرتے ہیں, اپنے کلچرل نارمز کو لے کے آگے چلیں.
اس میں یہ ہماری اپنی جو نجی ثقافت ہے یا اپنی نجی جو سوچ ہے وہ کیسے رد ہوتی ہے کہ اگر ہم اس لیے کھڑے ہوں کہ ہمارے ہاں عورتوں کے ساتھ ظلم نہیں ہونا چاہیے, یا گھر کے اندر جو ہے کہ چار دیواری کے اندر ہماری جو بیٹیاں ہیں, بہنیں ہیں, مائیں ہیں, ان کو جو ہے ان پہ ظلم ہو, یا آپ جو ہے اگر کسی کے اوپر جو ہے وہ ریپ کا ہو, تو اس کے خلاف کھڑا ہونا یہ کون سی مغرب کی بات ہے؟ نہیں, آپ نہیں کہہ رہے ہیں, لیکن جو تہمت لگائی جاتی ہے وہ یہی ہے. اب یہ بتائیے, اس کا آپ مذہب کے حساب سے دیکھیے, ثقافت کے حساب سے دیکھیے, اپنی قدروں کے حوالے سے دیکھیے, جو بھی آپ پیرامیٹر رکھتے ہیں, تو میں تو نہیں سمجھتا اس میں کوئی مغرب کی جو پیروی کی جا رہی ہے. اگر ہم یہ کہیں کہ کوئی لڑکی کو اس کا اتنا ہی حق ہوتا ہے کہ سڑک پہ بغیر کسی ڈر و خوف کے وہ چلے, جیسے آپ اور ہم بس پہ چڑھتے ہیں, کوئی فرق نہیں پڑتا. دیکھیے 70-80 سال ہو گئے ہیں, میں یہاں کا تو نہیں جانتا ہوں, لیکن کراچی کے اندر جو کتنی اور جو خواتین جو ہیں وہ کالج جاتی ہیں, دفتر جاتی ہیں, پتہ نہیں نوکری کرتی ہیں. ہمارے گھر میں چولہے نہ جلیں, اگر ہزاروں لاکھوں کے حساب سے عورتیں ہمارے گھر میں آ کے روٹیاں نہ ڈالیں, صفائیاں نہ کریں. یہ بات نہیں ہے کہ عورتیں کام نہیں کرتی, کام کریں, لیکن ہمارے آنکھوں سے اوجھل ہے. اور وہ بس میں حصہ اتنا ہی رہ گیا ہے, بس کا حصہ جو ہے وہ بالکل نہیں بدلا ہے. تو اب اس میں مغرب اور مشرق کا کیا مسئلہ ہے؟ اس میں ہماری ثقافت اور اسے کیا اس کو خطرہ ہو سکتا ہے؟ سوری
کہ ہم اپنی کانسٹیٹیوشن آف پاکستان کو اٹھا کے پڑھیں. اس میں ہمارے بہت سارے فنڈامنٹل رائٹس دیے ہوئے ہیں, اور اینڈ دا Constitution was voted on unanimously in 1973 and then again in 2009, 2010. The 18th Amendment was voted on unanimously. At that time, fundamental rights were not considered apart from the West and something that we don't want. So we want our fundamental rights, but we don't want them for women.
But دیکھیں, نہ صرف کانسٹیٹیوشن, آپ کے جو فاؤنڈنگ فادر تھے قائد اعظم محمد علی جناح, انہوں نے کہا تھا کہ یہ انسانیت کے خلاف جرم ہے کہ قیدیوں کی طرح آپ ہماری عورتیں چار دیواری میں بند ہیں, آپ شانہ بشانہ اپنی خواتین کو لے جائیں. تو یہ کہیں باہر کا تو نہیں ہے, یہ تو فاؤنڈنگ فادر پاکستان.
My question is about, I am from Balochistan and I was working as a consultant for violence against women in Afghan refugee camps in Lorelai. So I confronted the most oppressed women and men who were oppressing women. And what I found that most of their cultural practices, they were thinking they are Islamic. And they were using Islam as a weapon to practice their own cultural practices. And I think to eliminate this gender-based violence and bring equality among genders, I think we have to find some way how to counter those cultural practices.
Thank you. I'm sure you want to talk about it being the independent expert on cultural rights, but ایک میں quickly یہ point out کر دوں کہ یہاں پہ نہیں, پوری دنیا میں یہ ڈیبیٹ ہے کہ کون سی چیز زیادہ امپورٹنٹ ہے, کلچرل رائٹس یا ہیومن رائٹس. تو وہ میرے خیال سے ڈیبیٹ سیٹل ہو گئی ہے کہ ہیومن رائٹس جو ہیں وہ کلچرل رائٹس کو ٹرمپ کرتے ہیں. تو اس لیے, اور جیسے آپ نے کہا, سوری اوکے چلیں,
دیکھیں, نہیں میں یہ کچھ اور کہنا چاہتی, یہ جو رسم و رواج ہے نا, یہ بلوچستان میں ہم بھی کام کر رہے تھے عورتوں کے خلاف تشدد پہ. We were working, sorry, I can't decide what language to speak in, on violence against women and girls. We were at a college, and the whole question is we gave the youngsters the task of writing up or making a poster or doing whatever they wanted on violence against women and girls and their culture there. The question that I asked them is, why do Baloch want to be identified as their cultural identity in terms of violence? There are so many traditions. Secondly, there are this culture, which is the largest sense of creative, expressive thinking of people, and then their bad habits. And thinking that women are unequal and treating them badly as part of bad habits, and like all bad habits, we just have to give them up. Don't associate those practices with your culture.
Okay,
We will have 3 more questions, और वो हम इकट्ठे करके उसके बाद उसका जवाब देंगे, please, if you don't mind.
I just want to ask a question. I've actually pursued a thesis, or as part of my BA honors thesis, that was about women empowerment, a case study of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And recently, I had a presentation there in Peshawar about it. When we started discussing this thing in class, what's the discourse of feminism, like, I mean, the students were taking it very silently. But when it came to Islam and feminism, everything just started revolving around it. And the first question that they put to me that, you know, it somehow seems like we are importing something from the West, why we can't adjust it in the local context. This is the first question. The second question that I want to ask is this thing, that what I think that feminism in our part of the world is most of the time being considered as it's something very much women-centric, which is not the case in point. Like, it also talks about the vulnerabilities that men are having because of the strict identity of malehood. And sometimes it becomes very difficult to catch up with those with that kind of assigned identity. So question is, when you talk about women movement in Pakistan, so the kind of discourse that is being produced here, is it also shedding a light on the kind of vulnerabilities that men are having? Because what I think that is very necessary to engage men in this discourse.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Question, please.
Two questions. I'll try to put them very briefly. One is that all the people here, the men as well as women, are all those people who are already in favor of enlightenment, empowerment, all those things. What does the women's movement, how does it address all those people who are in opposition, who's against? Give us some guideline as to how we should address or try to win over those who are in opposition. This is one question. The other one stems from what you said in the beginning about the doctor brides. Now, I'm a doctor myself, and when I got admission in medical college, there were reserved seats. Like, most of the seats were for men and very few for girls, and we got our admission there. After that, then all the girls, medical students, fought for open merit, that whoever has the most marks is going to get admission, with the result that now there are more female doctors than male doctors. But lots of those female doctors are sitting at home, they're not working. And those that are working don't want to do night duties because the environment is largely not safe. Now, going by the economic realities, then we did move forward. Like you said, it's 2 steps forward and 1 back. But economically, we are suffering because we are spending money on doctors. The government subsidizes medical education. So it is spending on doctors, but then all those women are at home. And until there is enough enlightenment to let people let their daughters or their daughters-in-law work, then what happens meanwhile? And what happens at night with all those night duties?
There's a gentleman at the back. He's been raising his hand for, and there's His Excellency. Short question, please, very short.
Okay, so hi, I'm from New York, and coming from abroad and being raised abroad, I struggle being leftist and also being Muslim. So this is actually a question towards Ayesha and Fareeda. So Ayesha, you mentioned that the Women's Action Forum sort of
This is Ayesha.
maintained a...
This is Ayesha, by the way.
Oh, sorry, Ayesha. So you mentioned that there's a sense of secular, open society is what feminists should work towards, and that social movements now can think about undoing what Zia ul-Haq did in Pakistan. And you mentioned secularism a lot. And Fareeda, you also mentioned that the Women's Action Forum sort of maintained a secular element. My struggle as being both leftist and Muslim, and this is a question, is that why can't we look at historic precedents in Islamic societies and find feminist ideologies and examples there, and then instead of aiming for secular society, aim for Muslim society, or still an Islamic Republic of Pakistan that is plural, that is still open. So for example, like Hazrat Ayesha led a battle of the camel. That's a very feminist example. There are examples of Muslim Spain where a lot of pluralist Jews and Christians and Muslims live in societies. So why can't we look at that? Why does secularism have to be the answer to fundamental human rights? Why can't we look at just Islamic forms?
Okay. Last question from Mr. Yafas Khote.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Jean-François Cotin. I'm the European Union ambassador to Pakistan. And we are funding here in Pakistan a number of programs, the EU and the member states of the European Union, for supporting women, women's empowerment, women's rights. So listening to what the different questions, maybe one of them I did not get it because it was in Urdu. I'm sorry, my Urdu is still very weak. Should we stop actually as European Union and member states of the EU to support pro-woman programs here? Because it's obviously promoting maybe for some people here in Pakistan a Western agenda.
Should we stop funding programs for women because they come across as being part of a pro-Western agenda? I don't think that, any programming or funding that is rights-based is not a Western agenda because rights are our agenda also. So I think that as a researcher, I've also been able to document in great detail the way in which feminists in Pakistan have strategically used donor funding in order to achieve their rights. And when you have a state that is not supporting the achievement of equal rights for women, then we are constrained to receive support from wherever we can get it. I would also like to add that it's the international feminist movement that has also pressured Western countries to give attention to women's issues in our part of the world. So we need to even be concerned about the waning of the international feminist movement and the implications that that has for our countries as well.
And quickly, just Mr. Kote, an endorsement of supporting the women's movement has come in the form of our country passing many laws, very progressive women's laws, which used to be taboo earlier on. So please don't let it detract you. Kamran.
Just one comment. I think the tension is actually in terms of the support one gets and the publicity of the support and where it is. So that is something that, especially on sensitive issues, maybe need to be considered. But of course, we think it's important because when you don't have social, corporate, responsible local companies or other places to raise money, we do raise money for human rights and we have the same agenda.
Kamran, can you talk about masculinity?
First, no, why don't you finish then?
So, on the other questions, I think masculinity is a feminist issue. And I often say that we will never end violence against women and girls until we change what it means to be a man in Pakistan. And I'm clear about that. And I think that is a challenge for this generation. How to get engaged? You know, there's so many ways. There's no one way of getting engaged. And we did what we thought we could do with the people that we had, with the expertise, with the resources, whatever. I think everyone has to get engaged. Nobody is going to tell you, go talk to your neighbor, talk to your friends. That is also engagement. You do not have to come out in the public, although in our time that was what we felt was needed, and we did. However, in terms, for instance, one of the things that I would encourage all of us to do is what the UK women did many decades and decades ago, which was a campaign called Take Back the Night. So literally women went out on the street and they took back the night because that is where security fears were highest. So your doctors who do not want to go for night duties, etc. You need to have some symbolic things which are large and which leave an impression. And on that Take Back the Night, I expect all these wonderful men to be with us. Secondly, the secular. What is secular? And then let's be clear. Why is it a contradiction to you to be a believing Muslim and go for and believe in a secular state? I have several completely believing, practicing Muslim friends who have been completely for secular states. Secular means that the state's policies and its laws will not be based on religion. It does not mean whatever other people may have in mind. This is what it means to me. That is the secular state, that all citizens, regardless of who they are, what their color is, what their gender is, etc., are all equal. To me, that's the secular state.
And it's quite obvious that you're coming from New York. Would you like to live in a Christian state in the United States? The issue is that there are kind of tensions that Muslims in the United States, I live there, I've lived there for 32 years. So the kind of problems of discrimination against Islamophobia, I understand that. But the issue is that if there is violence against women, if there is unsafe spaces, as Fareeda Shaheed is saying, that women have, I mean, what is sort of Islamic or non-Islamic about that, right? I mean, you would stand with us in the sense that domestic violence should end, sexual violence against women should end, women should feel safe in public spaces at night or day or any time of the day, right? So I think if the issue of common goals that Fareeda Shaheed, I think, if I understand her correctly, is that these are the common goals, right? If we agree for everyone in this, men, women, straight, gay, whatever, right? That we all have certain kinds of basic, if you can call it rights, or basic sort of ideas about what a human being, what kind of life we want to lead. I'll stop there and I'll just go. Okay, the issue of masculinity, of course, it is part of the issue of gender. Today, if the kind of vulnerabilities that men are facing in this socio-economic condition, where there have been mass people are not guaranteed jobs. I mean, in Orangi, anecdotal, everyone says, oh, there are women-headed households here. There are women-headed households all over Pakistan. Men are, the whole sort of drug epidemic that came to, I'm from Karachi, that came, a lot of women had husbands, either they succumbed to that or they could not provide, and their women had, so what do you do with that, right? I mean, or you have Pashtun men in Karachi, conductors and drivers 17 hours on potholed roads, and what kind of lives do that have? I mean, that whole sort of, their work life is chewing them up and spitting them out, and then they have various kinds of home repercussions at home that they sort of take it out. So these are issues that all of us understand. The class is something that we are all sensitive to, and it is a feminist issue. So I think we need to understand that.
I think we'll have to end at this because I'm being repeatedly told that the time is over. You can ask the panelists outside some of the burning questions that you have. I want to end with a round of applause to Ayesha for capturing the history of women's movement.
Thank you. Thank you, Fauzia.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether sorry, you can't hear me? Even though Prince Hamlet when he was giving this soliloquy, he was talking about his pain and unfairness of life. And acknowledging that the alternatives might be worse, this is an existential question that baffles or bothers most women today, or at least some women for sure. And even though it may not be bothering many women in such a profound and tragic manner, most women today are dealing with the confusion of who to be and how to be. Whether to conform to the image of the good Pakistani woman subjected to social and institutional strictures on how she should dress, where she should work, who can she speak with, and what she can think, or to be the rebel, the outcast, sometimes even termed as the liberal woman. The phenomenon of the doctor brides that we talk about a lot recently, which leads to about 50% of Pakistani women, medical graduates, giving up 5 or 6 years of blood, sweat, and toil just to become the good bahus who are not supposed to work and to reap the rewards of submission. I've also come across architects, engineers, and chartered accountants who give up their work because the state and society does not place much value on their work, enough to provide the facilities, the supports that women need to continue working, for example, such as just daycare centers, hostels, or even washrooms at the workplace. So how did women come to this? This is the topic of today's discussion, I guess, in Ayesha Khan's book, where I'm assuming she's going to walk you through, well, I know that she's going to walk you through the history of women's movement in Pakistan, which I feel, even though it began in 1948 with the Objectives Resolution, the political project of Islamization of the country has been continued by the successive governments. which has forced women into restrictive roles to appease religious and sometimes conservative elements. Or religious arguments, social and religious arguments were given where sometimes rights were denied in the name of Islam, sometimes in the name of the social structures. And I'm reminded of the 1956 Commission on Muslim marriage and family laws in Pakistan, which recommended maintenance to divorced women, upon divorce, of course. But one member dissented, saying, and I quote, that the grant of maintenance to the divorced wife would not only mean monetary injustice to the present wife, but also lead to the moral degeneration of the beneficiary. The aid from a man who has lived as a husband for a long time would mean a standing threat to the chastity of the divorced woman. Maulana Maududi similarly made an argument that it will be against the Sharia as well as against the accepted canons of justice. The canons of justice were suddenly a big problem for women, where a divorced wife, he says, is entitled to receive maintenance from her divorcing husband. The divorced wife is not supposed to receive maintenance for her divorcing husband because it is not specified in the Quran and Hadith. And this is despite the fact that over a dozen countries, even today, do grant maintenance to divorced women, which includes Iran, Turkey, Jordan, Indonesia, UAE, Yemen, etc. But these exclusions and denials of rights in the name of religion, in the names of society, have been used forever, resulting at times in institutional discrimination, such as women not being allowed in the foreign service up until 1973. Or when Ziaul Haq came, women being restricted from foreign postings because they couldn't go without a mahram. I will not go too much into the stereotyping and the gender essentialization that has been having to contain women, but I do want to talk about a little bit about the impact that this misogyny is having on women, and it is bringing about this tension in their minds between being themselves or being the good Pakistani woman. And interestingly, this narrative which has been created by the state has impacted not just by the Muslim women, but also, or impacted not just the Muslim women, but also the Christian, Hindu, and Sikh women. If you talk to them, they have completely absorbed the narrative of who the good woman is. And I do want to quote Kishwar Naheed's poem a little bit, where she talks about those women who rebel and are known as the Gunahgar Auratein. हम गुनाहगार औरतें, ये हम गुनाहगार औरतें हैं जो अहले जुब्बा की तमकनत से ना रोब खाएं, ना जान बेचें, ना सर झुकाएं, ना हाथ जोड़ें, ये हम गुनाहगार औरतें हैं. She talks a lot about other things also. I mean, she continues to talk about गुनाहगार औरतें who are rebels. But I will ask now Ayesha Khan, who is to talk about her book, The Women's Movement in Pakistan, Activism, Islam and Democracy. Just a little introduction, Ayesha, of Ayesha. She's a director at the Collective for Social Science Research in Karachi. She's been a journalist in international radio, local TV and press, and has also served on the boards of various NGOs. Her work covers gender and development, reproductive health, conflict and refugee issues. The Women's Movement in Pakistan is her first book, but she has contributed regularly to journals including the International Feminist Journal of Politics and Feminist Economics. Ayesha, if you don't mind, I'll introduce the other panelists also before we go on to your book. Fareed, to Ayesha's left is Kamran Asdar Ali. He's a professor of anthropology, Middle East studies, and Asian studies at the University of Texas. He was the director of the South Asian Institute there, and he is currently the dean of Mushtaq Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences at LUMS. He told me to restrict my introduction to just a couple of lines, but I'll still go on and tell you that he's the author of Planning the Family in Egypt, New Bodies, New Selves, and the co-editor of Gendering Urban Space in the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. He's contributed consistently to journals as well as written other books. His most recent book is on communism in Pakistan called the Surkh Salam. To his left is Fareeda Shaheed. I'm sure you all know her. She is the executive director of Shirkatgah Women's Resource Center, one of Pakistan's leading women's rights organizations. Fareeda is the first UN independent expert and special rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. She's published widely on women's issues and movements, including co-authoring the award-winning book, Women of Pakistan, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. which she wrote with Khabar Mumtaz in okay. One step forward, two steps back. Two steps forward, sorry, one step back. Okay, which she wrote with Khabar Mumtaz in 1987, and it chronicles Muslim women's movement in South Asia from the turn of the 20th century till the 80s, and Ayesha takes it further. Her other book, which I found very interesting, is Women's Lives, Shaping Women's Lives, Laws, Practices, and Strategies in Pakistan, which is useful for people like myself who are working today. So Ayesha, before I ask you to talk about your book, the women's movement in Pakistan, I do want to quote Srilata Batliwala, where she really appreciates your book, and I'm just going to, this is the one. So Srilata Batliwala says that the history of the women's movement in Pakistan is a story with enormous contemporary relevance, not only for South Asia, but for challenged women's movement around the world. This work is a guidebook for these times. It is a highly analytical, yet immensely inspiring account of the struggle, endurance, and courage of the meshwork of individuals, networks, organizations, and strategies that embody the women's movement in Pakistan. One that no regime or political upheaval in that country has been able to destroy. Over to you, Ayesha.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fauzia, Kamran, and Fareeda for joining me on this panel today. And thank you to those of you who have come to listen to me speak about my book. And I feel humbled to be speaking in front of some great activists in the audience, but I will do my best to do justice to the subject. I would like to begin with a few words on why I felt it was important to write a book about the women's movement, Islam and democracy at this juncture in time. I started to work on it about 5 years ago. The audience I had in mind was the younger generation, for whom I wanted to provide a short history highlighting women's struggle for their rights in a state that has promised them on the one hand and taken them away with the other. I wanted to explain how it was that Malala Yousafzai, after she got shot, could be blamed for bringing Pakistan a bad name. I wanted to lay out the case for Asma Jahangir's statement that democracy is survival for women. And I wanted to detail how it was that the women's movement lead organization, the Women's Action Forum, arrived at the position that for all citizens' rights to be realized, we must have a secular state. How has it happened that the word secular and the human rights discourse has become equated in the public imagination in our country with being anti-religion and pro-imperialist? Nothing could be further from the truth. So I wanted to remake the case for posterity, if nothing else. This book is an effort to tackle these questions using the interviews and writings of those who have led the movement for women's rights. It is an effort to demonstrate that the women's movement has created the leading progressive discourse in Pakistan today. Most of the written work and research on women in Pakistan has been produced by activists themselves, beginning from the 1980s. Unfortunately, many books and reports are now out of print and were never widely enough circulated in the first place. I draw on their work to show how these women have wrestled with some of the most important questions that remain with us today. Sadly, during the course of my research, we lost some of the activists who founded WAF, but I was lucky to have recorded some of their interviews in time. I argue in my book that women activists are still playing a critical role in addressing Pakistan's incomplete nation-building process, to be better than something than it is. We are evolving into an exclusionary state, increasingly defined by those who are less than equal. It started with mobilization by religious groups against the Ahmadi community soon after Pakistan's creation, then moved on to include other minorities and women during General Zia's regime in the 1980s, and since then the proliferation of militant groups have targeted Shias, ethnic Hazaras, and more. I describe this exclusionary process as it has unfolded over successive regimes, drawing the connections between anti-democratic regimes and their political offspring, explaining the lines that connect the politics of General Zia to the rise of the Taliban in the Northwest. Consistently and forcefully, the women's movement has protested against every step of this process. This is a history that all of you own, and it needed to be documented. I argue that we are all engaged in a political project. Our struggle is never just subjective. In the post-9/11 world where Islamophobia has reared its ugly head in the West, I don't believe the response is to defend the political project of faith-based organizations at home. Their history of undermining women's rights and turning this country into an exclusionary state cannot be ignored. In Pakistan, even faith is a political project, and we are all accountable to the uses to which our religion has been put. The women's movement has had the courage to engage with and suggest answers to some of the most difficult existential questions the nation faces. What should be the role of Islam in the affairs of our state? And why, in practice, are the rights of women and religious minorities less than equal? If citizenship is conferred to all equally, as it is under our Constitution, then we must exercise our fundamental rights to benefit all citizens, whatever their religion, ethnicity, or class. And ultimately, only a democratically elected government, free to debate and resolve these issues, and accountable only to the people, should decide on the pressing issues of state and society. Arguably, the most significant campaign of the women's movement has been their political one, to restore the constitutional provision for reserved seats in all of our legislative assemblies. Activists from WAF worked together with leading NGOs for over a decade to build support from the grassroots to leading politicians for a women's quota in local government and the assemblies. When General Musharraf restored the quota in 2002, it was for mixed reasons of his own, but there was virtually no political opposition to the move. With women on reserved seats in the assemblies, the long process of reform has been pushed ahead, one law at a time. We now have laws against sexual harassment, exchange of women to settle tribal disputes. We have legislated against domestic violence and to raise the legal age at marriage for girls. We have improved the rape laws and made it harder for murderers to get away with honor killing. Activists have gone to court against local bans to prevent women from voting. They have pushed for electoral law reforms enacted just in time for the recent elections to ensure that political parties back more women candidates on general seats. This is the history of Pakistan that is not taught and will not make it into our official textbooks. But as I hope my book will demonstrate, we are gaining ground in inches. Activists know very well that even the progressive legislation of the last few years are one thing, but their implementation is quite another. Institutions like the National Commission on the Status of Women and its provincial counterparts need to become more empowered to ensure the government meets its commitments to us as citizens. In the meantime, I would say that there have been no more serious critics of the women's movement than activists themselves, who struggle with some unresolved questions. Should we have become more directly engaged in political parties? Some activists have been elected in parties and have made significant contributions to the legislative process. We also ask ourselves, did the time that we spent on NGO activities detract from a stronger political activism that may have made even more gains for women? Have we nurtured a second tier of feminists who can take our agenda further and build a stronger political consensus around a progressive Pakistan? I believe every generation will have to discover for itself what is the social justice movement of its age. Just as the Me Too movement has mobilized young feminists around the world today, the generation before had to define for itself what feminism meant in our context. Similarly, while democratic forms of government are being questioned by populist regimes around the world, even in the US, it will be up to the younger generation in Pakistan to decide afresh why democracy remains a valid choice. I hope by sharing with you the journey of the women's movement as we have seen and lived it, you will be inspired to build on its achievements and become part of an effort to build a more inclusive Pakistan.
Thank you, Ayesha. You've talked about the questions within the movement and the questions raised with the linkages between the links between the women's movement and other movements. For example, Fareeda, you talk about the labor rights. Kamran, you've talked about the left and how the whole question of the women's question was dealt with in the pre-1980s and all. So can you talk a little bit about the relationship of women's movement to other social movements and issues of collaboration? Fareeda, if you could start, and Kamran can take it from there.
Okay. I'm delighted, for one thing, that there's so many young people, and that more than half almost seem to be young men. So welcome to the session on how to make a better Pakistan. Clearly, women and women's movements are embedded in a particular point in time, and we can't change society until we actually change the structures and systems of society. Gender is not the only form of oppression, although gender runs through every other form of oppression, but you do have class, which is very important. You have oppression and discrimination in the name of religion, ethnicity, and various other things. So it is important that we forge those links. And the Women's Action Forum did try very hard in the beginning to come together and to convince and talk to the labor movements and the unions, including to say that the trade union movement could not simply be about men in factories. It had to be about the whole family, and convince them to bring their women to the May 1st events, and also to start addressing them, because we'd be at these huge rallies and they would say, mere bhaiyo, behne baithi thi, no mention of that. And can I say very unfortunately, that much as I have sympathy for the left was completely blind to the gender issues also. And although there was a number of the women who are a part of the women's movement, part of Women's Action Forum, come from a leftist, from a progressive background, they had to fight within their movements, and I think that's a challenge now. How do we ensure that the gender issue becomes something important for everybody, is an integral part of different agendas? And I think that's the challenge that all of us face today.
Yeah, I can only agree with Fareeda Sahiba. I mean, the little that I can contribute, and especially in an audience in where a lot of people who have, you know, not only been part of the women's movement but also of the left. I think in the post-1980, I mean, the creation of WAF, of course, didn't come out of anywhere. There were people who were already involved in various kinds of movements, social movements and groups. And especially, of course, there's a history of, you know, Ayesha Jalal has an article in the early 1990s in Kandioti's book about, and traces some of that history of Afwa and also of the various kinds of laws, the 48, 49 inheritance law and the 61 family law. But especially the kind of activism that starts in the 70s, even in this kind of populist or kind of democratic Bhutto movement, who basically, at one level, there were lots of things that opened up spaces for women and also for labor, but there was also a certain kind of repression. And historically, the female body becomes a repository of cultural sort of authenticity. And the way Bhutto's repression, as well as other sort of rulers have done, a lot of times the female became the victim of a political game between men. And then in the Zia era, I think very early on in the Zia era, I think women started coming out for democratic rights. And I think the history has been written by you and Khawar Sahiba, you know, and then how that was formed. What I would like to say, and I totally agree about the way in the left movement sort of silenced the women's question. I mean, of course, there were people here who are sitting here, but even in Karachi, Nurani Sahiba and others, who, Mumtaz Nurani Sahiba, you know, the kind of the communist, you know, biology is not women's destiny, and those kinds of arguments even in the 50s were coming. But what I'm trying to suggest is that there has been a general silencing of female voices in the political realm. And if we, And this was partly Ayesha Jalal's argument as well, that there was a certain kind of patriarchal bargain of a certain kind of an elite struggle in which, people were involved in the pre-80s. And the kinds of stories or struggles or histories or experiences or practices of most of women was not part of that kind of struggle, which was basically, even in academia, we wrote almost always about, I'm talking about pre-1980s, about elite struggle. So, and then our colleague, friend, and I suppose also a partner in arms, Shahnaz Raus's work is very important because she suggests, amongst others, also that we have to go to different kinds of archives. I'm speaking like an academic, like memoirs or biographies or diaries or even fiction, to really recuperate those silences of how, what were women's experiences. And it's not that 1980 is some 1980 or 82, 83 is a turning point and things don't continue. But I think there is some way that we have to also think about our own histories in different ways, where there has been exclusion and silence of certain kinds of voices. And how do you bring it back?
One addition. I just want to share two things. One, you have to have a common political goal. Otherwise, no matter how much you engage with other movements, it's not going to happen. And associations. We tried, as Women's Action Forum, with nurses associations, with the telephone and telegraph people, but they had a very limited vision of improving their livelihood within parameters. We had something else. And the second thing, just to mention, it's never easy. And the first demonstration that we had on 12 February 1983, that wasn't the first, but the first big one, for which we have the National Day of Pakistan, when we came back, tear gas, the first big thing on the Mall, the first thing we were said by our allies, our friends, well done, well done. Now do it for democracy. So there's always this thing of, you did well, but we want it for something else. We want your activism, but not necessarily the agenda that you're putting forward. And that's the change.
Well, that was the argument, that, you have to wait your turn, and when revolution comes, all discrimination will go away, right? And the issue is that was also the question, the ethnic question, right? Or language, linguistic question, yeah? So all kinds of difference had to be subsumed. You see, the whole question, what the gender question brings up is the question of difference. And that, I think, could not be reconciled entirely. I'm not saying by individuals people understood it, but it couldn't be entirely reconciled in a particular kind of left framework. That's...
Thank you. Ayesha, I know that you've talked about the tensions within the women's movement also, especially on the question of engaging with the Islamic argument to promote women's rights. Can you talk about it a little bit more?
I think that one of the great things about the women's movement in Pakistan is that it has opened up for discussion so many issues that are very difficult to resolve. And it has tried to resolve some of them. Some of them, WAF took a stand that it would call for a secular Pakistan and that it would be a secular organization. And that was not without internal struggles and debates and debates that continue. I think that we're not a static society, and what WAF was able to accomplish even internally in 1991 when this decision was taken, I think right now it would be very hard to get together a women's organization that would take a similar stand. So the question of religion is something that everyone struggles with. We all struggle with the issue of personal faith versus political agenda, and to what extent does one reflect the other or predict the other? And is it possible to be a believing Muslim and not believe in some political thing called the Ummah? And I've started teaching activism in IBA, and I find the students are struggling with the same thing, and they're absolutely riveted by the writings that women from WAF, who are seated here today, have produced dealing with these very, very difficult questions. So I don't think that some of the deepest questions in our society are easy to resolve. And I think that every generation will open up the question again. And similarly with the issue of democracy, you have to choose democracy again and again. And you might have to find that this whole discussion of a secular state has to be reopened and then chosen again in this generation, because as you can even see in the US, rights once taken can be thrown away without a second thought. So we have to have an open society where we can really have debates without fear of consequences, and we are not able to have that here. I mean, I think that even in 1991, it was a more open society to have the discussion than it is today. So I don't think the answer is in saying these problems or these questions can be resolved once and for all. I think you just have to always be having open debates and letting people work it through again and again.
Fareeda, can you tell us a little bit more? I know you know a lot more history, being so involved in the women's action, about the tensions within and how they were resolved.
I think we had many tensions. This was just one of them. And I think as movements are made up of multiple streams and multiple individuals and organizations. Let's not limit, I think Women's Action Forum epitomizes is the name of that movement, of a particular moment in time. You were talking at a particular moment in time when everything was being rescinded in the name of Islam. It became the Women's Action Forum was a platform to bring together as many voices as you can on a minimum platform. At that point, that was how do you get people to raise their voices in a military regime against their proposals and still have them come with you? And at that point, we felt, that's why we called ourselves non-political. I think we're all very clear gender is essentially a political issue, but we called ourselves non-political. We also, when the issue, and only when the issue was proposed, the rescinding of rights was proposed in the name of Islam, we responded from within because we felt there was no other option at that time. There were huge debates, but one of the principles of Women's Action Forum, which I think is wonderful and should be maintained by everyone, is that once the heated debates, and there were many debates and discussions and we disagreed, once the decision was taken, nobody spoke about it. Of course, we had no social media, so maybe if we did, we would have acted differently. But the discussions and debates and disagreements stayed internal. They were not brought to the fore. And I think that's something, 10 years later, we felt we were also non-aligned rather than non-political. And we decided we are clear, there can be no equality of all citizens unless the state is based on a secular principle. Because otherwise, you will always have the issue of people from other religions, what is their status, and other identities. So therefore, we decided to stay with that, and we've stayed with that ever since.
No, one thing I actually want to just add to what Fareeda Shaheed is saying is that there was the activism, and then there was also sort of thinking about what kind of a state we are living in. And I think your own participation along with, and the sort of ways in which we are also linked with other parts of the world. So the women living under Muslim law, I mean, the point was to really think whether in Malaysia or Algeria, the kind of ways that there is a certain kind of, and the book is also reflective that laws matter, activism at the level of change in the parliamentary or political arena matter at the same time that we do grassroots activism and try to, raise voices there. In a couple of things I'd say, sometimes alliances, perhaps, and I'm maybe an outsider, but alliances are made at a very contingent moments. So for instance, I remember, and maybe in Lahore as well, but in Karachi, I distinctly remember that when there was a series of incidents of sexual violence against women, there was an organization which actually WAF also supported war. And yeah, exactly, it was war against rape. And in that, women from right-wing parties also participated. Actually, I was when I was doing my fieldwork in the Middle East, Palestinian women were sort of negating and saying, we can't work with Hamas and things. And I would bring up these kinds of, because they were allies and we would have discussions. And basically we said, well, there are certain moments that we can come together in terms of if there's a safe space issue, in terms of public space issue, or ideas, or the whole sort of the horror of sexual violence against women, then it's not an Islam or a secular issue, it's an issue of bodily, safety. And so in those cases, like I also, again, talking about silences, I mean, I've worked with women in the ready-made garment industry and how they traverse public spaces in terms of transport, and then actually in the 80s, and some people may remember maybe Hannah Papanek's sort of thing about portable solutions, burqas being portable solutions in the sense of going from one point to another. And so I'm just saying that these are important things, and in that sense, when people criticize our young women and men, especially women who have this women at dhaba or girls at dhaba, I feel very uncertain that why are you, I mean, okay, you can call them elitist and these kinds of things that WF people always felt, but it is opening a space for women to occupy the public spaces and argument that continues to, that needs to be done, and legislation has to happen. People like Shilpa Patke and all in Bombay have worked a lot on this. So I think there are lots of ways in which the young, the sort of younger generation is linked with that history that WAF came up with. And there are certain kinds of practices that are as crucial to talk about today as when, and that's the link. That's the link. Sorry, I'm going on and on.
Ayesha, I do want you to talk a little bit about the relevance of the women's movement today. What are some of the factors that impacted, and also the question on the whole question of engaging with the Islamic argument or the Islamic framework, where because of which it has sometimes been criticized as being not so inclusive, because it refuses to engage with the Islamic argument as such. And I know that currently that is one of the criticisms that is leveraged on the women's movement, that while it talks about indigenous feminism and being inclusive, it doesn't include that narrative, which we find so much around us nowadays. So please.
So I think that two things. One is that Zia had a social engineering project, and he had huge amount of funding for his social engineering project, and the result is what you see now in Pakistan today. The difficulty in discussing so many issues, the difficulty in critiquing Islam and feeling that everything has to be justified within the religious framework, as if that is the only framework we have in Pakistan. And I actually don't believe that we need to necessarily be so engaged in that. If we don't want to, we don't need to apologize for that. I've been doing field work on a number of issues in Pakistan for 20 years. I have gone all over the country to, whether it's a reproductive health research project, whether it's a refugee-related research study, and Islam has never frankly come up. To be honest, it hasn't. Women have not come up and said, we really want our water rights. What does Islam tell us about access to water? It doesn't work that way, So, I mean, there are ideas we can have in our heads about debates that we must be engaged with, but there is also realities on the ground. So I actually feel that, it was very important to lay out this history of WAF because we will probably not any longer have like a political discourse or an ideological position that is secular maybe for another few generations, because the country has changed so much. And I think that you're right that, we are criticized for not engaging in the Islamic discourse, but everyone needs to understand why. And I thought it's really important that the book be written so that so that the new generation understands why was that decision taken, what was the benefit of the decision, what was the political import of it, and if maybe one or two generations from now there will be space again to have a secular discourse, they will have the antecedents written down in history.
Do you want to add?
No, I think sometimes we don't have faith in people. I think actually we do have space for secular discourses, despite what may be apparent at one level. And what I would like to say is, and, we've already said, movements are different streams, et cetera, et cetera. You need to have a common goal. Is the goal common that you can call it part of the movement or not? So are we against the basis of gender inequality? Full stop. One, And therefore, if you do not accept that there is a hierarchy between genders, how can you accept hierarchies between class, ethnicity, religion, and various other things? That's my very personal position. I'm sure that gender equality is what, if they do, fine. That does not mean we all have to sit together and hold hands. Everyone can contribute to the movement in the way that they want. But one thing which I think is absolutely crucial, you know, they say you have to put your money where your mouth is. And for the last few months, I've been saying the state needs to put its mouth where at least where some of its money is, but really where its policies and laws are. So for instance, we have 7 million unwanted, unplanned pregnancies every year. Of that 7 million unplanned, 4 million are unwanted. 2.2 million end up in abortion. Another 1.4 million people admit we never wanted this. So why are we not being able to deliver that unmet need of reproductive contraception? It's not because of the end users. As Ayesha says, nobody says, tell me if Islam allows this. I'm sorry. Third research going, it is your duty bearers, it's your service providers. That's where the narrative needs to change. You are supposed to be able to get an abortion, you are supposed to be able to get contraceptives and your basic health units. They are state employees. The state is allowing its state employees to get away with not fulfilling their mandate because the state will not take a position. You have domestic violence. How often do they say this is a crime? We don't hear the narrative. The narrative must change, and it must change not just from us, but also from the state.
Go ahead.
I just want to, you know, I was mentioning in my talk that there's a number of new laws that have been passed as a result of increased women's participation in the assemblies and how important implementation of these laws is. So the domestic violence bill was passed in the Sindh Assembly 5 years ago, and not a single case was filed of domestic violence against a man in Sindh until recently. So a friend of mine who's a young activist lawyer filed this case and just sent me an SMS this morning that the first conviction under the domestic violence law has been passed by a court in Karachi. And whatever we may say, laws do change society. The impunity with which murder can be committed in Pakistan as a result of the Qisas and Diyat ordinances has changed Pakistan. For evidence, you just need to look at Nafisa Shah's book, Honor Unmasked, to see how the court system and the law enforcement system has changed as a result of this legal impunity for murder. Similarly, we're going to find that, you know, with the first man being put in prison in Sindh for domestic violence, maybe that will change society a bit too. So hats off to young women activists.
No, I just wanted to, again, reiterate my colleagues, what they were saying. See, it's ironic that now we have all these sort of big conferences on population and, you know, everyone is sort of, you know, whatever, the ex-chief justice all of a sudden found out that there are too many Pakistanis in Pakistan. The point is that, ironically, in the 60s, the entire edifice of American population dynamics programs cut their teeth here. As they did in the malaria program, right? The population, and all these big names at Hopkins and Harvard and everything, they cut their teeth here under the Ford Foundation and Rockefeller grants. And so the issue is that exactly, where is the money? Where was the implementation? And now, I mean, then also those experimentations are very problematic because we became, our female bodies or our women's bodies became the site for experimentation for long-term IUDs, high-dose pills, and all kinds of things, right? And the men were, of course, ignored, and then they say, oh, it's Islam. And then they would do some